The mist hung low over the French countryside that cold November morning in 1944, threading through the skeletal remains of what had once been orderly vineyards. Captain Heinrich Müller pressed his back against the stone wall of a half-destroyed barn, his breath coming in short, visible bursts. He had fought in Poland, survived the Russian winter, and clawed his way through the Norman hedgerows. But nothing in his 6 years of war had prepared him for what he was about to face. Through the fog he heard them before he saw them, a sound unlike anything he had encountered on any battlefield. It was singing, deep and rhythmic, carrying across the frost-hardened earth with an otherworldly quality that made the hair on his neck stand rigid. Then they emerged from the white veil like spirits summoned from some ancient realm, African soldiers of the French colonial forces, moving with a silent, predatory grace that transformed the European theater of war into something entirely new and terrifying. Sergeant Mamadou Diallo of the Senegalese Tirailleurs had crossed an ocean and a desert to reach this moment. Born in a village outside Dakar where the baobab trees grew thick and the Atlantic crashed against rocky shores, he had been 22 when French recruiters came speaking of duty, honor, and the great struggle against fascism. What they didn't mention was how the cold would penetrate his bones in ways the Sahara sun never had, or how French officers would serve his units smaller rations than their European counterparts received, or how the citizens of the nation he was defending would look at him with a mixture of fear, curiosity, and something darker that he couldn't quite name. But Mamadou had learned to push such thoughts aside. He had seen friends die in Tunisia, watched brothers in arms fall in the Italian mountains, and somewhere along the blood-soaked path from Africa to Europe he had stopped expecting gratitude and started expecting only survival. The German captain wasn't alone in his terror. In the town of Colmar, just 15 kilometers to the east, elderly French civilians huddled in cellars, whispering stories that had reached them through the chaos of battle stories of African troops who showed no mercy, who fought with knives as readily as rifles, who seemed immune to the fear that paralyzed ordinary men. Madame Rousseau clutched her rosary beads, her arthritic fingers working the worn wood with desperate intensity. She had lived through the previous war, had seen her husband return broken from Verdun, and had spent the past 4 years under German occupation. Now liberation was coming, but the liberators wore faces that reminded her how vast the French Empire truly was, how many peoples had been pulled into this European catastrophe. Her daughter Marie stood by the cellar window, peering through a crack in the wooden boards. "Mamang," she whispered, "they're not what the Germans said they would be." The propaganda had done its work with ruthless efficiency. Joseph Goebbels had seized upon the presence of African troops in Europe as proof of French degeneracy, of a civilization so corrupted that it armed savages and turned them loose on the cradle of Western culture. German radio broadcasts spoke of atrocities, of barbarism unleashed, painting these colonial soldiers as something less than human. And in the twisted logic of Nazi racial ideology, African troops represented an existential threat, not just militarily but culturally, the ultimate symbol of a world order the Reich sought to prevent. What the propaganda machine couldn't anticipate was how these same soldiers would become legends, not for their brutality but for their extraordinary courage under impossible circumstances. Mamadou's unit had been in continuous combat for 17 days. They had advanced through the Vosges mountains in fighting so intense that the snow turned red with blood, where the cold killed as efficiently as enemy bullets. He had watched Corporal Canut from Bamako freeze to death in a foxhole because their supply lines had been cut and winter uniforms arrived 3 weeks late arrived, notably after white French units had been fully equipped. He had seen Lieutenant Diop, who spoke 4 languages and had studied law in Paris before the war, denied entrance to the same cafes where German collaborators drank wine after the liberation. Yet here they were, pushing forward into enemy territory while the very people they were liberating locked their doors and shuttered their windows at their approach. The first contact came at dawn. Muller's machine gun position erupted in a staccato burst that shattered the morning silence. Mamadou dropped to the frozen ground, his rifle pressed against his shoulder, and in that instant he was back in Tunisia, back in Sicily, back in every firefight that had taught him the terrible mathematics of survival. He moved forward in short rushes, using terrain the way a leopard uses tall grass, and the German defenders found themselves facing tactics they hadn't encountered before. These weren't conscripts or factory workers given rifles and pushed into battle. These were professional soldiers from cultures with their own warrior traditions, men who had hunted in African forests and tracked prey across open savannas, now applying those skills to the lethal game of modern warfare. British Lieutenant James Crawford of the Somerset Light Infantry watched the assault from a communications post half a mile away. He had grown up in Surrey, attended proper schools, and absorbed all the unspoken assumptions of empire, that Africans were simple, that they needed European guidance, that their role was to serve, not to lead. The scene unfolding before him through his binoculars challenged every assumption he had carried from childhood. The Senegalese troops moved with a coordination and tactical sophistication that impressed even his battle-hardened sergeant. "Bloody hell," muttered Sergeant Williams, a veteran of North Africa who had seen his share of combat. "They're taking that position apart like clockwork." Crawford lowered his binoculars, uncomfortable with the admiration in his subordinate's voice, uncomfortable with his own response to what he was witnessing. The German position fell in 40 minutes. Muller survived, pulled from the rubble by 2 Senegalese soldiers who could have killed him but instead gave him water and dressed his wounds before sending him to the rear as a prisoner. He would spend the rest of his life trying to reconcile what he had been told about these men with what he had experienced in that barn. Years later, in the scattered fragments of memoir he would write but never publish, he would describe Mamadou's face, not the savage countenance of propaganda, but the exhausted, determined expression of a professional soldier doing an impossible job with inadequate support. As the Allies pushed deeper into Germany, these encounters multiplied. In Italy, Moroccan Goumiers, Berber tribesmen from the Atlas Mountains, had already established a fearsome reputation during the brutal mountain warfare that characterized the Italian campaign. These irregular troops, serving under French command, fought with traditional curved knives alongside modern weapons, and their ability to navigate mountainous terrain at night made them invaluable during the assault on Monte Cassino. Italian civilians fled at their approach, terrified by stories, some true, some horrifically exaggerated, all filtered through the distorting lens of racial fear of what these North African soldiers did in battle. Private Alessandro Romano had been forced into the Italian Social Republic Army, Mussolini's puppet state in northern Italy, and found himself defending a mountain pass near Piedmont in early 1945. He was 19, had never wanted to fight, and spent most firefights praying to survive until he could surrender. When Moroccan Goumiers took his position in a midnight assault, he prepared for death. Instead, he found himself disarmed and sent stumbling down the mountain path toward Allied lines, shaking not from cold but from the cognitive dissonance of still being alive. The men who had spared him wore faces that reminded him of the markets in Tripoli where his uncle had traded before the war, faces that belonged to the empire Italy had tried to build in Africa, now returned to haunt the empire's collapse. But the complexity of these encounters went far beyond simple battlefield mercy. In newly liberated French towns, African soldiers faced a bitter irony that cut deeper than German bullets. They had bled for France, had died by the thousands in defense of a nation that had colonized their homelands. Yet when the victory parades were organized, when the photographs were taken for newspapers, when de Gaulle made his triumphant entries into liberated cities, the African troops were often held back, kept out of sight. The policy was never stated officially, never written down in orders that historians could later uncover, but it operated with devastating effectiveness. The liberation of Paris in August 1944 was choreographed to emphasize French participation, with white troops given prominent roles while African and Arab soldiers who had actually done much of the fighting were positioned at the margins or left out entirely. Sergeant Diallo stood in a village square in Alsace 3 days after the fighting moved on, watching white French troops accept flowers from grateful civilians who never asked where the Senegalese had gone. A young girl approached him cautiously, her mother hovering nervously nearby. She held out a small bunch of wildflowers picked from the field where Mamadou's unit had been bivouacked. "Merci," she said softly, her accent the thick Alsatian that mixed German and French into something unique to this borderland. Mamadou took the flowers, his throat suddenly tight. This child at least saw him as a liberator. He knelt down to her level and in careful French said, "Your world is safe now. That's all that matters." But as he watched her run back to her mother, he wondered if she would remember this moment, or if the official histories being written even now would erase it, would erase him, would render invisible the contribution of hundreds of thousands of African soldiers to Europe's freedom. The erasure had already begun. American photographer Robert Capa had documented Senegalese troops in combat, had captured images of extraordinary bravery. But when magazines published the war's story, they favored shots of white American and British forces. French colonial propaganda had always been contradictory, simultaneously praising African loyalty while maintaining rigid racial hierarchies, but the contradiction became unbearable. In the crucible of liberation, General de Gaulle needed to resurrect French pride after the humiliation of 1940. And that pride required a narrative where France liberated itself, not one where Africans and Arabs constituted a substantial portion of the liberating force. Yet the soldiers themselves could not be wished away, could not be edited out of the experience of those who encountered them directly. In the German town of Baden-Baden, occupied in the war's final weeks, Frau Weber watched from her apartment window as Senegalese troops set up checkpoints and began the work of military governance. Her husband had died on the Eastern Front. Her son was missing somewhere in the chaos of Germany's collapse, and she had prepared herself for the worst when the Allies arrived. The African soldiers below spoke French to each other, handled their weapons with casual competence, and showed neither the vindictiveness she feared nor the civilized restraint she thought only Europeans capable of. They were simply men doing a job, tired and far from home, enforcing the occupation of a defeated nation. One of them, she noticed, read a book during his breaks read with obvious fluency, turning pages while smoking cigarettes and occasionally laughing at something in the text. The image unsettled her more than violence would have. Violence could be understood, could fit into categories of barbarism and savagery. But literacy, leisure, humanity displayed casually, these required her to question assumptions she had never thought to examine. The reckoning came in different forms for different people. For soldiers like Mamadou, it came in the bitter years after the war when they returned to colonies where nothing fundamental had changed despite their service. They had been promised citizenship, better treatment, equal pay promises that evaporated in the face of France's determination to maintain its empire. The Tirailleurs massacre of December 1944, where French forces killed dozens of Senegalese soldiers protesting discriminatory pay, revealed the limits of gratitude. These men had fought from Berhakim to the Alps, had suffered casualty rates that exceeded European units, had asked only for the basic dignity of equal treatment, and were answered with bullets. For Europeans who encountered these soldiers, the reckoning was more subtle but no less profound. British Major William Thompson, who coordinated with French colonial forces during the final push into Germany, wrote letters home that revealed a man struggling with the implications of what he had witnessed. His son would discover these letters decades later in an attic trunk. The Senegalese fought magnificently today. Their officers tell me they have been exemplary throughout the campaign. I find myself thinking about father's stories from India, about the sepoys and Gurkhas, about all the men from the empire whom we armed and trained and sent into battle. What must they think of us? What will they remember when they go home? Thompson never published these reflections, never spoke them aloud in the officers' mess where the old hierarchies still held. But he carried the questions until his death in 1962, the year Algeria won its independence from France. The African soldiers themselves carried different memories. Corporal Ibrahim Keita, who survived the war and returned to French Sudan, later Mali, would tell his grandchildren stories of the cold, of battles in places with names like Athien and Colmar, of French comrades who treated him as an equal, and French officers who treated him as expendable. He would describe the moment when his unit entered a concentration camp in southern Germany, the skeletal prisoners who emerged blinking into daylight, the industrial machinery of death that made their own suffering seem insignificant by comparison. We thought we knew what evil looked like, he would say, his voice dropping to a whisper even 40 years later. We had fought against it for years, but we didn't know. We couldn't have imagined in that camp surrounded by evidence of genocide. The racial theories that justified colonialism revealed their ultimate conclusion, and every African soldier who witnessed it understood with terrible clarity what the Nazis would have done to them had the war gone differently. The German soldiers who fought against African troops and survived to see the war's end carried their own complicated memories. Muller, the captain who surrendered at Colmar, would spend his final years trying to reconcile his wartime experiences with the propaganda he had believed. In a nursing home in Munich in the 1990s, he would confide to a young social worker, herself the daughter of Turkish immigrants, that his capture by Senegalese troops had probably saved his life not just physically but spiritually. They showed me that everything we had been told was a lie, he said, his aged hands trembling. Not just about the war, but about who was human and who wasn't. I had to live with that knowledge for 50 years, knowing I had fought for those lies. He died before he could complete the memoir, before he could fully articulate what it meant to have your worldview shattered by the humanity of those you had been taught to despise. The end of the war in Europe came with flags and celebrations, with dancing in the streets and kisses for liberators. But for African soldiers, the armistice brought a different kind of liberation, the freedom to finally acknowledge their exhaustion, their losses, their betrayal. Mamadou stood at attention during a ceremony in Berlin where medals were distributed and generals made speeches about freedom and sacrifice. His unit had fought for 11 months with minimal rest, had lost 60% of its original strength, and had advanced farther into Germany than most French units. Yet when the official photographs were taken, his company was positioned at the rear, barely visible, while white French troops stood prominently in front. He felt no anger in that moment, only a deep, bone-tired certainty that he would carry this knowledge forever, the knowledge that his service, his sacrifice, his courage had been necessary for victory, but would be inconvenient for memory. As the men prepared to board ships for the long journey back to Africa, Lieutenant Crawford found himself at the Marseille docks, watching Senegalese troops march up gangplanks. He recognized individual faces, men he had coordinated with during operations, and realized with sudden clarity that he had never learned most of their names. They had been the Senegalese, the Colonials, the African troops, categories rather than individuals, functions rather than men. Now they were leaving, carrying with them experiences that would transform their colonies in ways the British and French empires couldn't yet imagine. Crawford watched them go and felt the first stirrings of doubt about the world he represented, doubts that would eventually drive him to support decolonization in the face of fierce opposition from his own class and generation. The African Soldiers' War had revealed something that European powers had worked for centuries to obscure, that colonialism's racial hierarchies were convenient fictions rather than natural laws. When African troops fought as well as or better than European soldiers, when they showed tactical brilliance and strategic understanding, when they displayed all the qualities supposedly unique to civilized peoples, the entire intellectual edifice justifying empire began to crack. The Nazis, with their explicit racial science and genocidal logic, had merely made visible what colonialism had always implied, that some humans were more human than others, that some lives mattered less than others, that violence could be justified by the color of skin and the accident of birth. But the soldiers had shown something else. By their courage, their professionalism, their humanity in circumstances designed to strip it away. They had demonstrated that the categories were lies. Every German who surrendered to African troops and lived, every French civilian who was liberated by Moroccan Goumiers, every British officer who coordinated with Senegalese units, of these encounters chipped away at the foundation of racial empire. The process would take decades, would require movements and struggles and rivers of blood, but the seed had been planted in those cold European battlefields where African soldiers fought for a freedom they themselves did not fully possess. Years later, when Mali and Senegal and Morocco achieved independence, when the French Empire dissolved and the British Commonwealth transformed into a voluntary association, historians would debate what caused decolonization. They would analyze economic factors, political movements, Cold War dynamics, and nationalist leaders. But perhaps the answer lay also in those small moments during World War II, a German captain receiving water from the enemy he expected to kill him, a French child offering flowers to a liberator her society would try to forget, a British officer watching colonial troops and beginning to question everything he had been taught. History is made not just by grand forces but by individual encounters that accumulate into transformation, by the slow work of reality eroding ideology. Mamadou returned to Senegal in the summer of 1946, his uniform worn thin, his body marked by scars, and his mind heavy with memories. He had crossed an ocean twice, had seen the heart of Europe in its moment of greatest crisis, had fought in battles that would fill history books where his name would never appear. In his village, children gathered to hear his stories, and he told them carefully edited versions, the adventure and the courage. But not the discrimination, not the erasure, not the bitter knowledge that he had been more valuable dead than alive, more useful in war than in peace. But his wife saw through the careful omissions, saw the weight he carried. And one night as they lay beneath the mosquito netting listening to the familiar sounds of their homeland, she asked him what he had learned in Europe. Mamadou was silent for a long time. Then he said, "I learned that we are as brave as any man. I learned that we can fight, can think, can plan as well as any European. I learned that their civilization is not stronger than ours, just older at certain kinds of destruction. And I learned that they will never willingly acknowledge any of this, that we will have to take our freedom just as we had to fight for theirs." His wife took his hand in the darkness, and together they lay awake, listening to the same wind that had blown through African nights for millennia. Before empires, before colonies, before the word Europe had any meaning in Senegal. The war was over, but the longer struggle had only begun. The story of African colonial troops in World War II remains one of history's necessary reckonings, a reminder that liberation is complex, that courage exists across all boundaries of race and nation, and that those who fight for freedom deserve to share in it. When Europe first saw these soldiers, saw them fight and die for countries that had colonized their homelands, the encounter forced a confrontation with contradictions that colonialism had always contained but never resolved. Some Europeans responded with fear, some with respect, some with a willful blindness that would persist for decades. But the soldiers themselves, men like Mamadou and Ibrahim and thousands of others whose names we will never know, they knew their worth even when others denied it, carried their dignity even when it was not recognized, and planted seeds of liberation in the very act of fighting for nations that had not yet learned to see them as fully human. The winter of 1944 gave way to spring, and with it came the final collapse of the Third Reich. Mamadou's unit pushed deeper into Germany, liberating towns where civilians emerged from cellars with white flags and terrified faces. In one village near Stuttgart, an elderly German woman approached him as his squad searched abandoned buildings. She was perhaps 70, bent with age and hunger, and she carried a photograph in her shaking hands. "Mein Sohn," she whispered, showing him the image of a young man in Wehrmacht uniform. "My son, have you seen him? Is he alive?" Mamadou looked at the photograph, at this mother's desperate hope, and felt the weight of every contradiction the war had created. This woman's son had fought for a regime that considered Mamadou subhuman. Yet here she stood, treating him as the only authority who might answer her prayers. He shook his head gently, unable to give her the comfort she sought. Unable to explain that her son had fought for a vision of the world that would have enslaved or destroyed everyone who looked like Mamadou. She nodded, understanding crossing language barriers, and shuffled away, clutching her photograph like a talisman against grief. These encounters accumulated, each one a small earthquake in the edifice of racial thinking that had structured European consciousness for centuries. In village after village, German civilians discovered that the African soldiers they had been taught to fear were professional, disciplined, and often more merciful than they had any right to expect. The cognitive dissonance was profound and unsettling. How could these men, described in propaganda as barely human, conduct themselves with such restraint? How could they show compassion to a defeated enemy when that enemy had sought their extermination? The answers to these questions required a rethinking so fundamental that many Germans simply couldn't manage it, preferring instead to forget, to minimize, to explain away the evidence of their own eyes. But others couldn't forget. A German physician named Dr. Ernst Hoffmann, pressed into service treating wounded soldiers in a makeshift hospital near the French border, found himself working alongside a Senegalese medical corpsman named Amadou Tall. For 3 days, as casualties poured in from both sides, they worked together in a blood-soaked operating room, communicating through broken French and urgent gestures. Amadou's medical training had been limited, learned on the battlefield rather than in universities, but his steady hands and quick thinking saved lives that Hoffmann's exhausted expertise alone couldn't have preserved. On the third night, as they collapsed in exhaustion between waves of wounded, Hoffmann offered Amadou a cigarette. They smoked in silence, two men on opposite sides of history's greatest conflict, united momentarily by the simple humanity of shared exhaustion. Years later, Hoffmann would write in his private journal that those 3 days had taught him more about the bankruptcy of Nazi ideology than all the philosophy he had studied at Heidelberg before the war. The Moroccan Goumiers, meanwhile, had their own complex story unfolding in the mountains of Italy and southern Germany. These Berber warriors from the Atlas Mountains brought with them centuries of mountain warfare tradition, tactics that proved devastatingly effective against German defensive positions. But they also brought customs and behaviors that horrified both their French commanders and Italian civilians. Reports of looting and assault followed their advance, and whether these reports were accurate, exaggerated, or deliberately fabricated by German propaganda became a matter of bitter debate that continues among historians today. What's undeniable is that the Goumiers operated in a moral gray zone that reflected the complexity of colonial military service. They were simultaneously warriors fighting for freedom and colonial subjects denied basic rights in their homeland. They were praised for their battlefield effectiveness and condemned for their supposed savagery. They were essential to the Allied victory in Italy and deliberately written out of the victory narratives that followed. Captain Marcel Dubois of the French colonial forces spent the entire Italian campaign coordinating with Goumier units, and his relationship with these North African soldiers defied easy categorization. He respected their military prowess, depended on their courage in impossible situations, and struggled constantly with the racial prejudices of his upbringing and training. In his diary, which his granddaughter would donate to a French military archive in the 1980s, he wrote with unusual candor about this internal conflict. Today, Hassan's men took an enemy position we had bombarded for 3 days without success. They scaled cliffs in darkness that our Alpine troops said were impossible. 6 men died in the assault. Hassan brought me the German officer's surrender personally, saluted smartly, and asked permission to bury his dead according to Muslim custom. I granted permission, of course, and watched as they performed their rituals. These men are better soldiers than most French units I've commanded, yet they receive half the recognition and twice the suspicion. If we lose our colonies after this war, and I believe we will, it will be because we never learned to see what was in front of our faces. The prophetic quality of Du Bois's observation would become clear within a decade. The seeds of decolonization had indeed been planted in the battlefields of Europe, watered by the blood of soldiers like Mamadou and Hassan, fertilized by the contradictions that could no longer be ignored. When African soldiers returned home carrying weapons, military training, and the lived experience of having defeated the supposedly superior European race in its own heartland, the colonial order's days were numbered. The French government tried desperately to contain this knowledge, to reassert the old hierarchies, but you cannot unring a bell, cannot make soldiers forget that they had been essential to saving European civilization from itself. In Algeria, soldiers who had fought at Monte Cassino and in the Vosges returned to find French settlers still firmly in control, still enforcing the discriminatory code duel indigenate that made them second-class citizens in their own land. In Senegal, veterans like Mamadou discovered that their military service had earned them neither political rights nor economic opportunity. The promises made during desperate recruiting drives, promises of citizenship, equality, prosperity, evaporated like morning mist under the harsh sun of renewed colonial administration. The betrayal was so total, so systematic, that it radicalized even those soldiers who had fought most loyally for France. The Tirailleurs massacre became the symbol of this betrayal. In December 1944, just months after the liberation of Paris, West African soldiers returning from the war gathered at the Tirailleurs transit camp near Dakar to demand their back pay. They had fought for 4 years, had suffered and died for France, and now they wanted simply to be paid what they had been promised. The French military's response was to open fire on the unarmed protesters. Killing estimates ranged from 35 to hundreds of men, with the true number obscured by official cover-up. The massacre sent a clear message. African soldiers might have been useful in war, but they would not be tolerated in demanding equality and peace. The blood spilled at Tirailleurs watered the seeds of independence movements across French West Africa. Meanwhile, in Britain, the return of African colonial troops created its own reckoning, though one that unfolded more gradually and with less overt violence. The thousands of African soldiers who had served in the King's African Rifles, who had fought in Burma and East Africa, returned home with similar expectations of change. They had defeated fascism, had proved their capability and courage, and now expected some recognition of their contribution. British colonial administrators, like their French counterparts, had no intention of fundamentally altering the colonial system, but the returning soldiers brought with them ideas, connections, and organizational skills that would prove crucial to independence movements in Kenya, Tanzania, and across British East Africa. The psychological impact of these soldiers' service extended far beyond their own experiences. Every village that sent young men to fight in Europe received them back as living evidence that Europeans were not invincible, that African soldiers could match them in battle, that the entire structure of racial superiority that justified colonialism was built on lies. Griots and storytellers across West Africa began incorporating these soldiers' tales into the oral traditions that had preserved African history for millennia. Children grew up hearing not just about ancient kingdoms and legendary warriors, but about their own fathers and uncles who had fought in France, who had defeated German armies, who had looked to European civilization in its moment of greatest crises, and had not flinched. The European civilians who had witnessed these African soldiers carried their own complicated legacy forward. For some, the experience genuinely changed their worldview, opening cracks in the racial ideologies they had absorbed from childhood. Lieutenant Crawford, the British officer who had watched Senegalese troops assault German positions with such professional skill, became after the war a vocal advocate for decolonization, much to the dismay of his family and social circle. He testified before Parliament about the contribution of colonial troops, wrote letters to newspapers arguing for independence, and died in 1967, having seen most of the British Empire dissolve, a process he had come to see as morally necessary rather than as national decline. But for every Crawford, there were dozens of Europeans who witnessed the same events and drew entirely different conclusions. They acknowledged that African soldiers had fought bravely, but attributed this to French or British leadership rather than African capability. They admitted that colonial troops had been essential to victory, but insisted this proved the wisdom of colonial rule rather than its injustice. They saw what they wanted to see, filtered reality through assumptions so deeply embedded that no amount of contrary evidence could dislodge them. This willful blindness would characterize European attitudes toward decolonization throughout the 1950s and 1960s, with many former colonial powers treating independence movements as ingratitude, rather than as the logical consequence of the very values they claimed to have fought for during the war. The children and grandchildren of the African soldiers of World War II would carry their ancestors' legacy into the independence struggles that followed. In Algeria, veterans of the Italian campaign became leaders of the FLN, applying military skills learned fighting fascism to the fight against French colonial rule. In Kenya, Mo fighters included men who had served in Burma, who brought back not just military training but a fundamental understanding that the British Empire was neither invincible nor eternal. Across Africa, the generation that won independence in the 1950s and 1960s stood on the shoulders of the men who had fought in Europe, who had demonstrated that Africans could organize, fight, and defeat European armies when given the chance. Mamadou lived to see Senegal achieve independence in 1960. He was 58 years old, his hair gray and his body marked by old wounds that ached in the rainy season. When President Leopold Sedar Senghor, himself a veteran of the war, captured by Germans in 1940 and held prisoner until 1942, spoke at independence ceremonies, Mamadou stood in the crowd and wept. The tears came not from joy alone, though joy was part of it, but from the release of decades of accumulated grief, anger, and frustrated hope. He thought of the men who hadn't survived to see this day, friends whose names appeared on no monuments, whose sacrifices had been erased from official histories. He thought of the young girl in Alsace who had given him flowers and wondered if she remembered, if she had ever learned that the liberator she thanked had been forced to fight for his own country's freedom a second time. He thought of Captain Müller, the German officer his unit had captured, and wondered if he too had lived to see his country rebuilt, and what he made of the world that had emerged from the ruins. The legacy of African colonial troops in World War II extends beyond the political independence their service helped catalyze. It lives in the families who preserve their stories, in the historians who work to recover their erased contributions, in every person who recognizes that the fight against fascism was genuinely global, that people from every continent and culture participated in defeating the greatest evil the modern world had seen. When we forget these soldiers, when we tell the story of World War II as purely a European and American affair, we repeat the same erasure that began even before the war ended, the same denial of full humanity that made colonialism possible in the first place. The moral arc of this story is long and still unfolding. The nations these soldiers fought for, France, Britain, Belgium, have still not fully acknowledged their debt. Pensions were denied or reduced, contributions minimized, discrimination continued long after the war ended. It took until 2010 for France to equalize pension payments between French and colonial veterans. And even then, the gesture came too late for most of the men who had earned those pensions through blood and sacrifice. The monuments at European cities rarely mention African names. The textbooks that teach children about the war rarely include chapters on colonial troops. The collective memory of the conflict has been whitewashed in the most literal sense. Yet the truth persists, carried forward by descendants who refuse to let their ancestors be forgotten, by scholars who excavate buried histories, by artists and filmmakers who give these stories the prominence they deserve. The African soldiers of World War II did more than help defeat fascism. They demonstrated through their courage and sacrifice the hollowness of the racial ideologies that had justified centuries of exploitation. Every German who surrendered to an African soldier and lived, every French civilian who was liberated by Moroccan or Senegalese troops, every British officer who coordinated with colonial forces, each carried forward, consciously or not, the evidence that the categories of superior and inferior, civilized and savage, were lies designed to justify oppression. In the end, perhaps the most powerful legacy of these soldiers is the simplest. They fought, they suffered, they bled, and they died for a freedom that should have been universal but wasn't. They exposed the hypocrisy at the heart of lied rhetoric about democracy and liberation. They proved their humanity in circumstances designed to deny it, and in doing so they helped create the conditions for their own people's eventual freedom. planting seeds that would grow into the independence movements that dismantled European empires within a generation. Their story is not a footnote to World War II, but an essential chapter, one that reveals the war's true global character and its lasting impact on the world that emerged from the ashes. When we remember them, when we speak their names and tell their stories, we honor not just their service, but the ongoing struggle for genuine equality and recognition that continues to this day. The debt owed to soldiers like Mamadou Diallo and thousands like him remains unpaid, but their legacy endures in the freedom their grandchildren possess, in the independence of their nations, and in the complicated memory of what it meant to fight for others' liberty while still denied your own.